At a private college tour meant for honor students, 17-year-old Malik was the only black teen in the group. When a silver watch went missing from the admissions office, security locked the doors. Without asking questions, they turned to him. Malik's backpack was still on the floor, untouched. But what they found inside wasn't the watch. It was something that shattered every lie in that room. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Elijah Cross had always believed numbers were the only place where truth couldn't lie. Numbers didn't care about skin color or last names. They didn't whisper, they didn't stare. They simply told the truth, precise, impartial, absolute. But the world around him, it wasn't built on numbers. It was built on glances, whispers, and quiet expectations of who belonged and who didn't. On that cold Monday morning, Jefferson High's glass doors gleamed like a fortress. The school's polished hallways were lined with photos of winning debate teams, robotics champions, and scholarship recipients, faces that rarely looked like his. His mother, Denise, had pressed his collar that morning, her tired hands trembling as she reminded him for the 100th time, "You don't have to prove nothing, baby. Just be you." But he knew better. In schools like Jefferson, being you wasn't enough. As Elijah walked into room 24, the air shifted. It wasn't loud. No one said anything outright. But the silence was thick enough to hear the judgment in it. 22 students sat in rows, mostly white, their laptops open, pens neatly aligned, their eyes flickering up at him before returning to their screens. Mrs. Elaine Whitmore stood at the front of the room, her beige cardigan matching the calm authority she carried, like perfume. Her smile was practiced, the kind that never reached her eyes. She was the kind of teacher who believed discipline and decorum proved intelligence. She noticed Elijah immediately, the outsider, the transfer, the new variable in her perfectly ordered equation. "Elijah Cross," she said, scanning her clipboard. "You're from Eastwell High, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, setting his backpack down gently by the last row. His voice was calm but carried a kind of quiet tension, like a violin string stretched to its limit. She murmured, making a note. "Eastwell, that's the public magnet program downtown, isn't it? Quite different from Jefferson's environment." It wasn't a question, it was a warning. Elijah nodded, keeping his eyes on the empty desk. He'd learned to read tone better than textbooks, and hers said, "You're lucky to be here. Take a seat in the back," she said, before turning back to the board. "We'll see where your placement scores truly put you." As he slid into his seat, he could feel the students' eyes following him. One girl, pale, freckles dusting her cheeks, whispered something to the boy beside her. He smirked, glancing over his shoulder. Elijah didn't need to hear it to know what it was. He'd heard it before. Affirmative action. "Quota, kid. Experiment." Mrs. Whitmore clapped her hands lightly, drawing the class's attention. "All right, everyone. Today we're starting with a review problem. Something to refresh your minds after the break." She wrote across the board in clean, deliberate strokes. "Fixie 3x quares, were x, whereas x to 1. Find the limit as x approaches 1. A few students groaned softly. "That's an indeterminate form," one muttered. "Exactly," she said, pleased. "So who'd like to begin?" Hands shot up from her usual favorites. Jason, Sarah, Amanda, all eager to perform. But then her eyes shifted. They landed on Elijah sitting in the back, quiet, unreadable. He wasn't raising his hand. He wasn't looking at her. And maybe that's what made her pick him. "You," she said sharply. "Elijah, why don't you show us how it's done?" A few heads turned. A boy in a varsity jacket snickered. "He's new," he whispered. Mrs. Whitmore smiled thinly. "Then this will be a good introduction." Elijah froze. He hadn't expected to be called. Not like this. Not on his first day. He glanced around, half expecting her to retract it, to say she was joking. But she stood still, arms crossed, gaze fixed. Slowly he stood and walked to the front. The chalk felt dry and heavy in his fingers. Every step echoed in the room like a countdown. He had solved problems like this hundreds of times before, but never with 20 pairs of eyes waiting for him to prove he didn't belong. Mrs. Whitmore leaned against her desk, voice light but cutting. "Take your time. We wouldn't want to rush brilliance." He wrote out the expression. His handwriting was clean, confident. He factored simplified, took the limit. His movements were deliberate, methodical. But then, as he reached the final line, something caught his eye. a subtle inconsistency in how she'd written the original function. The numerator wasn't balanced. It wasn't an ordinary problem. It was wrong. If he followed the steps by the book, he'd get a meaningless result, and she'd get exactly what she wanted. Public failure. He stopped. The chalk hovered midair. The laughter began softly, a ripple from the front rows. "What's wrong?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, feigning curiosity. "Too difficult?" Elijah looked back at the board. He could correct it, but doing so would mean exposing her mistake. The room waited, silent and expectant, the tension thick enough to choke on. He took a slow breath. "I think," he said finally, voice steady but quiet. "The problem might have a typo. If it's written this way, it's undefined. But if you meant the numerator to be 3x quart..." Mrs. Whitmore's face stiffened. "The problem is correct, Elijah." He hesitated. "Then there's no solution." A few students exchanged looks. The quiet was deafening. Mrs. Whitmore smiled tightly. "Interesting conclusion. Maybe if you had paid more attention, you'd see the path forward. But thank you for the effort." He stood there, chalk still in hand, unsure what to do next. The equation and the tension hung heavy in the air. As he turned to go back to his seat, someone muttered, "Told you. Doesn't even know the basics." Mrs. Whitmore didn't correct them. She didn't say a word. Elijah sat down slowly. His jaw clenched. The humiliation wasn't in what she'd said. It was in what she didn't. The rest of the class passed in a blur. He barely heard her lecture, barely noticed the scribbles on the board. His mind replayed the moment again and again. Her smirk, the whispers, the trap disguised as opportunity. When the bell finally rang, students rushed out, chatter spilling into the hallway. Mrs. Whitmore gathered her papers, ignoring Elijah completely. He stayed seated, pretending to adjust his notebook. He wanted to ask why, but before he could, she looked up, her tone sweet but sharp. "Elijah," she said, "next time, make sure you are prepared. Jefferson has higher expectations." He nodded slowly, biting back the words burning in his throat. As he walked out, he caught his reflection in the classroom's glass door. Calm, composed, unreadable. The same look his mother wore every time she came home from work, after someone talked down to her. He understood it now, that quiet strength disguised as restraint. But as he stepped into the hallway, a voice called from behind. "Hey, new kid," someone said. Elijah turned. It was Logan Pierce, the tall blonde golden boy of Jefferson High, captain of the mathletes, Mrs. Whitmore's prize student. Logan smiled. But there was something in his eyes, amusement or pity. Elijah couldn't tell. "Don't take it personal," he said. "Whitmore does that to everyone." "Well, not everyone." Elijah stared at him for a moment, then simply nodded. When Logan walked away, Elijah looked back through the glass at the board. The equation was still there, unchanged, wrong. And yet it had been his name on the line, not hers. For the first time that morning, Elijah felt the fire beneath the calm, a quiet, unshakable certainty that this wouldn't be the last time he'd be tested for daring to be right. As Elijah sat quietly at the back, the teacher scanned the room, smirked, and chose him for the opening problem, one even the top white students couldn't solve. Mrs. Elaine Whitmore had taught at Jefferson High for over 22 years. Her students called her Iron Grace, the teacher who never raised her voice but never lost a battle. Her classroom was immaculate, her tests infamous, her recommendations powerful. She was the kind of teacher who, on paper, looked like the best kind of mentor, structured, passionate, and deeply invested in excellence. But what few saw, or chose to see, was the quiet way she controlled the story of who succeeded and who didn't. To her, success had a look, a sound, a certain kind of polish. It was confidence without challenge, compliance dressed as intellect. She believed some students needed to be humbled to grow, and somehow that lesson always seemed reserved for the students who didn't look like the ones on Jefferson's promotional brochures. That morning, as Elijah Cross entered her classroom, Mrs. Whitmore had already decided he was a test. A transfer student from Eastwell, a public magnet where standards were different. He had high marks, yes, perfect ones in fact, but so had others before him who couldn't handle the rigor once they arrived at Jefferson. She wasn't cruel, at least not in her mind. She simply believed in maintaining order. And Elijah Cross, with his quiet eyes and unpolished shoes, represented disorder. As she wrote the day's equation on the board, she wasn't improvising. She'd chosen it deliberately, flipping through her lesson binder, earlier that morning, until she found one she'd used only once before. A problem from a college-level exam. It wasn't part of the syllabus. It wasn't even part of the curriculum. But it was, in her words, illuminating. Her chalk moved precisely across the board, white dust catching the morning light, like powdered frost. She could feel his presence even before she looked at him. Sitting near the back, attentive but withdrawn, taking careful notes in a second-hand binder. He didn't fidget, didn't interrupt, didn't try to make an impression. That to her was its own kind of arrogance. The arrogance of invisibility. "Elijah," she said suddenly, turning from the board. The sound of his name, sharp and unexpected, froze him mid-sentence. The entire class turned toward him. "Yes, ma'am?" His tone was respectful, cautious. "Would you like to try this one?" Her voice was honeyed, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. This wasn't an invitation. It was an evaluation. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "You mean, at the board?" She tilted her head. "That's usually where problems are solved." "Yes." A ripple of laughter moved through the class. A few students exchanged knowing glances. Elijah hesitated, then rose quietly. His mother's words from that morning played faintly in his mind. "Don't shrink, baby. Don't give them that satisfaction." He walked toward the front, the soles of his sneakers squeaking softly against the linoleum floor. Every step seemed longer than the last. He could feel the weight of eyes pressing against him. Not hostile exactly, but curious, expectant, watching to see what he'd prove or confirm. Mrs. Whitmore gestured to the problem with her chalk. "Let's see how Eastwell teaches calculus." The words were casual, but they weren't neutral. He caught the faint smile on her lips, the kind that came from knowing you'd already written the ending to someone else's story. Elijah nodded, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and looked at the board. It wasn't just difficult, it was vicious. A rational function with hidden limits, removable discontinuities, and nested exponents. It was designed to mislead anyone who hadn't memorized multiple approaches to L'Hopital's rule. He took a breath. "Take your time," she said sweetly. "We all learn differently." The sentence landed like a slap disguised as kindness. Elijah began to write. Slowly, carefully, he rewrote the equation, checking each symbol for consistency. The chalk scraped softly, rhythmic. His posture was firm, his movements deliberate. Mrs. Whitmore leaned against her desk, arms folded. "You seem confident," she observed. He didn't respond. He was focused, lost in the numbers. But beneath the surface, tension pulsed like an undercurrent, a war between fear and precision. The class was utterly silent. Jason, the self-proclaimed top student, slouched in his seat with a smirk. "This'll be fun," he whispered to Sarah beside him. But as Elijah worked, the smirk began to fade. His process wasn't random. It was elegant. Each line built naturally into the next, as if the numbers themselves trusted him. Mrs. Whitmore noticed it too. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar in her classroom. Uncertainty. Then just as he reached the midpoint, Elijah hesitated. He frowned, realizing something. The denominator's structure made the limit undefined. He turned slightly. "Ma'am, I think—" Mrs. Whitmore interrupted. "Just continue. Don't overcomplicate it." He nodded, but his instinct told him otherwise. The numerator wasn't balanced properly. One of the coefficients led to a contradiction. She had either written it wrong or chosen it that way on purpose. He adjusted his next line, reworking the equation to account for what should have been written. Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the air again. "Careful, Elijah. We don't change the question to make the answer easier." The class chuckled. His stomach tightened. "I wasn't changing it, ma'am," he said softly. "It's just that the function—" "Continue," she said sharply. "If it's too difficult, you may sit down." He didn't move. He continued writing. For a moment, all that existed was the soft tap of chalk and the whisper of his own breathing. He completed the derivative, simplified the expression, and reached the end. An elegant, correct solution. He circled the final number. It was simple, clear, beautiful. Then he stepped back. Mrs. Whitmore stared at the board, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she smiled thinly. "Interesting approach," she said. "Not quite correct, but creative." He turned, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Not correct?" She tapped the board with her ruler. "Your numerator is different from the problem given. You made an assumption instead of solving what was there. A good reminder for everyone. Follow instructions. Don't invent shortcuts." He froze. The problem's flaw, Her flaw had been the reason he'd adjusted it, but she'd turned that correction into insubordination. A few students laughed again. Someone whispered, "Told you he'd mess up." Elijah felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger, humiliation. The kind that burns slow and deep, because it's undeserved. He looked at the board again. The math was flawless. Anyone who understood the concept would see it. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't looking for accuracy. She was looking for control. "May I?" he began. "That's all, Elijah," she said, cutting him off. "Please take your seat." He placed the chalk down carefully, his hands steady despite the storm building inside. As he walked back to his seat, he caught a few glances, some mocking, some sympathetic. Logan Pierce, sitting near the front, shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen what Elijah had done. He knew it was right. But in this room, right and wrong didn't always belong to truth. They belonged to whoever held the chalk last. Mrs. Whitmore turned to the class. "Now can someone show us the proper method?" Jason raised his hand instantly. "I got it," he said, standing and grabbing a new piece of chalk. He wrote quickly, confidently, performing for approval. When he finished, his answer matched Elijah's almost exactly, except he'd used a slightly different algebraic path. "Excellent, Jason," Mrs. Whitmore said warmly. "That's how it's done. Consistency and attention to detail." Elijah's chest tightened. The room blurred slightly. Jason had essentially copied his work, yet Mrs. Whitmore celebrated it as proof of mastery. Jason glanced back at Elijah with a grin. "Guess great minds think alike," he joked, earning a few laughs. Elijah forced a smile, but something in him shifted. A quiet, cold clarity. He wasn't angry because she doubted him. He was angry because she'd used his intelligence as ammunition against him. The bell rang a moment later, releasing the tension into the hallway's chatter. Students packed their bags, whispering as they passed. Mrs. Whitmore erased the board with brisk, decisive strokes, as if scrubbing away his presence. Elijah lingered a moment, pretending to organize his notes. When the last student left, he turned toward her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think there might have been a mistake in how the problem was written." She looked up, her expression cool. "Mistake?" "Yes," he said. "The original equation." She cut him off again. "Elijah, I don't expect you to understand all the nuances of our material yet. Jefferson's program is rigorous. Don't be discouraged." "I'm not discouraged," he replied, "just confused." Her tone softened, falsely sympathetic. "You're bright, Elijah, but brilliance means nothing without discipline. Remember that." He stood there for a moment, the words settling like frost. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." When he finally left the room, Mrs. Whitmore exhaled slowly. She turned to the empty board, tapping the chalk once against her palm. In her mind, she'd done her job. She'd reminded everyone where the lines were drawn. But what she didn't realize was that Logan Pierce, the golden boy of Jefferson, had left his phone on during class, and the entire exchange was still recording, including her final remark. As Elijah walked to the board, she whispered under her breath, "Let's see if you're more than just attitude." Elijah Cross stood at the front of the classroom, the cold stick of chalk trembling slightly between his fingers. It wasn't fear of numbers that made his hands shake. He'd solved harder problems under more pressure. It was the silence, that thick, heavy silence that filled the air whenever people expected him to fail. Behind him, 20 pairs of eyes tracked his every movement. Some were curious, some impatient, and some, a few of them, especially in the front row, gleamed with the kind of satisfaction that only comes when you think you're about to watch someone embarrass himself. He could hear the faint whisper of sneakers tapping against the tiled floor, the shuffle of paper, the barely contained giggle of a girl near the window. But mostly, he heard his own heartbeat, steady but heavy, like a drum buried under the weight of judgment. Mrs. Whitmore stood near her desk, arms crossed, watching with that carefully curated expression of polite neutrality, a teacher's mask that hid every bias she refused to admit existed. She didn't have to say anything. Her silence was permission. It told the class exactly what they were allowed to think. Elijah wrote the function across the board again, taking a moment to breathe before beginning. The chalk left faint dust trails, breaking slightly as he pressed harder than necessary. He was focused, but he wasn't calm. Every time he moved, someone behind him snickered. "Man, he's gonna choke." Someone whispered, "Watch. He'll say the book's wrong again." The words hit him like pinpricks. He'd heard variations of that voice before. In hallways, at other schools, even online when he'd entered math competitions, and people assumed he'd cheated because of his skin color. He swallowed the sting and kept working. Numbers never cared who you were. That was what he'd always told himself. But now, under this fluorescent light, surrounded by expectation and cynicism, even the numbers felt heavier. He wrote the derivative, then factored the expression carefully, step by step. His brain moved with precision, muscle memory guiding his hand even when his confidence faltered. Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut through the quiet. "Explain what you're doing, Elijah, so the class can follow along." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes weren't. It wasn't a request. It was a spotlight. Elijah turned slightly, his voice low but clear. "I'm factoring out the common term before taking the limit. If I don't, the function stays undefined." Jason, sitting front and center, let out a short laugh. "That's not how she showed us." Mrs. Whitmore didn't respond to Jason, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. "Interesting," she said. "Go on." Elijah knew that word. Interesting. It never meant approval. It meant she was waiting for him to contradict her. He continued anyway. The board was nearly filled now, each symbol crisp, calculated. He was in control, almost. But then came the next step, simplifying the numerator. And there it was again, that same inconsistency from before. The function's design was wrong, deliberately wrong. He froze, eyes narrowing as he realized it wasn't a mistake. It was bait. If he followed the written problem, his work would collapse into nonsense. But if he corrected it like he had before, she'd accuse him again of changing the question. He hesitated. For half a second the classroom felt like a courtroom. Everyone was waiting to see what he'd choose, obedience or truth. Mrs. Whitmore tilted her head. "Something wrong, Elijah." Her voice was almost maternal now, filled with that gentle, condescending patience reserved for a child who was out of his depth. "No, ma'am," he said finally, "just making sure it's written correctly." A murmur rippled through the class. "What's he doing?" someone whispered. "It's just algebra," he continued, his hand steadying as he recalculated, choosing to follow logic rather than authority. Line after line, he brought the expression down, each step flowing into the next. And as he wrote, something happened. The snickers quieted. Even the whispers faded. For a brief moment, there was only the sound of chalk, quick and precise, like a musician returning to rhythm after hesitation. He wasn't performing for them anymore. He was solving for himself. When he finished the second-to-last step, he stepped back, scanning the equation with sharp focus. The logic was airtight. The final result would expose the flaw in the question itself. Then, from the back of the room, someone muttered, "He's taking too long." The fragile moment shattered. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was low, but it carried across the room. "Elijah, you seem uncertain." He looked at her. "No, ma'am, I'm certain." "Then finish," she said. "We're all waiting." He nodded, raising the chalk again. But just before he touched the board, something inside him stopped. It wasn't hesitation. It was instinct. He saw the error buried in the second fraction, one she'd written just slightly off, so that the final simplification would collapse. If he followed her problem exactly, the answer would appear meaningless, and she'd have her proof that he wasn't ready. His pulse pounded in his ears, every eye on him waiting. The room buzzed with quiet tension, and Mrs. Whitmore's expression softened, not kindly, but victoriously. "Go on," she murmured. "Show us your process." He turned, staring at the numbers that didn't add up. Then, for the briefest second, he glanced at her. Their eyes met. She knew, and he knew she knew. But she wanted him to fall anyway. He turned back to the board. Slowly, he wrote the correction. Not to prove her wrong, but to save the math itself from being butchered by prejudice. His chalk moved swiftly, confidently, rewriting just one symbol before finalizing the step. Then, the sound hit him. Laughter. It started from Jason, then spread like wildfire through the room. Sarah covered her mouth, trying to suppress a giggle. A few others snorted openly. "What'd he do?" someone asked. "He just changed her problem again." Elijah froze. The laughter got louder. Mrs. Whitmore didn't tell them to stop. She simply watched him, lips pressed in a faint smile that could be mistaken for restraint, but reeked of satisfaction. He turned toward her. "I didn't change it," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "It's just written wrong." Jason laughed louder. "Sure it is." The laughter twisted the air, turning humiliation into a performance. Elijah felt his throat tighten. His chest rose and fell, but he refused to break. He refused to let them see what it felt like to be brilliant and still treated like an imposter. Mrs. Whitmore finally raised a hand, and the laughter slowly died. "Elijah," she said softly, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but in this class we follow the assigned problem as written. You can't simply alter things to fit what you think it should be." He stared at her. "But ma'am, the function doesn't." She cut him off, still smiling. "That's enough for now. Please take your seat." He hesitated, looking at the board one last time. The numbers glared back at him. Correct, logical, undeniable. But in this room, truth wasn't the point. He put the chalk down, slow and deliberate, and turned back to the rows of smirking faces. Every step toward his desk felt heavier than the last. When he sat, Logan Pierce, the golden boy, glanced at him, frowning slightly. There was something in his eyes, something different from the rest. He wasn't laughing. He'd seen the truth in Elijah's work. But Logan didn't speak. Not yet. Mrs. Whitmore clapped her hands lightly, restoring order. "Now then," she said, "let's move on to someone else. Jason, perhaps you can show us the correct approach." Jason rose with a smug grin, taking Elijah's place. He began writing, fast and careless. His method was wrong, but it didn't matter. Mrs. Whitmore praised his initiative before he even reached the end. Elijah looked down at his notebook, the paper blurring beneath his gaze. The humiliation stung, but deeper than that was something heavier: disappointment. Not in himself, but in the system that turned intelligence into defiance when it came from someone like him. He'd done everything right, followed logic, stayed respectful, solved the problem. But still he was wrong, because the room needed him to be. When the bell finally rang, the class erupted in noise, laughter spilling into the hallway. Mrs. Whitmore erased the board quickly, leaving no trace of what had happened. Elijah stayed seated, waiting for the room to empty. His heart was steady now, but his mind was burning. He didn't know it yet, but one person had captured the entire exchange on video. And that recording would become the first crack in Mrs. Whitmore's perfect facade. His hand moved swiftly, but then just before the final step, he paused, and the room erupted in laughter. The laughter still echoed faintly when Elijah looked back at the board, but now the numbers seemed to stare back at him with defiance. For the first time since walking into Jefferson High's AP Calculus class, he realized this wasn't just about equations, it was about proof of who was worthy of being believed. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the front, chin slightly raised, as if daring him to challenge her again. The classroom's energy buzzed with something sharp and cruel. To the students, it was entertainment. To Elijah, it was survival. He could feel the heat crawling up his neck, the urge to sit down and let the moment die. But the problem still hung there, unfinished, He picked up the chalk again. "With respect, ma'am," he said quietly, "the problem doesn't make sense as written." The class collectively inhaled. No one had ever challenged Mrs. Whitmore so directly. Not Jason, not even Logan. She smiled faintly, eyes narrowing. "Are you suggesting there's an error in the material, Elijah?" He turned slightly, his voice measured. "I'm saying the numerator doesn't align with the limit function. If you factor it as written, you'll get a discontinuity that shouldn't exist." Jason snorted. "What's he even saying?" Mrs. Whitmore gave a small, dismissive laugh, the kind that made his statement feel naive before she even addressed it. "Well, perhaps at your last school they did things differently," she said. "But here we follow the text." Elijah's hand tightened on the chalk. He wanted to let it go. He wanted to sit down. But something inside him, something deeper than pride, refused. He faced the board again, erasing the last few lines with his palm, and began rewriting the equation carefully. His movements were quick, confident now. Every symbol was placed with intention. "If you allow me to show you," he said, his tone respectful but steady, "you'll see what I mean." The room grew quiet. Mrs. Whitmore didn't stop him, though her arms folded tighter across her chest. Step by step, Elijah broke the function down, narrating softly, as he went, not for her but for himself. He replaced one coefficient, restructured the denominator, and simplified. Within moments, the once confusing equation revealed its pattern, a perfect symmetry, emerging from what had been chaos. When he reached the final line, the class went silent. His result was elegant, not only correct, but beautiful. Logan's eyes widened slightly. He leaned forward in his seat, his own notebook forgotten. He'd never seen anyone do that. Not even Mrs. Whitmore. Elijah set down the chalk. That's the correct limit, he said, assuming the numerator was intended to be balanced.
The air in the room shifted.
Subtly, but unmistakably, even the students who had been laughing moments ago were staring at the board, caught between confusion and awe. Jason frowned. Wait, that actually looks right. Mrs. Whitmore didn't move. Her face was frozen, polite, expressionless, unreadable. Elijah turned toward her, not expecting praise, just acknowledgement. I think that's what you meant to assign, he said softly. Her smile didn't waver. I didn't make a mistake, she replied calmly. You altered the question. He blinked. But it's the only way it works. That doesn't make it correct, she said smoothly. In advanced courses, Elijah, we don't guess what a question should be. We solve what's given. He stood there, silent. He knew what she was doing, turning the room back against him, redefining correctness as obedience. Then, unexpectedly, a voice broke through the silence. Actually, Logan said from the front row. He's right. Every head turned toward him. Logan looked uneasy. But he continued. If you plug the original problem into Wolfram or Desmos, it's undefined. The only way to get a valid solution is by fixing that coefficient. Mrs. Whitmore's expression tightened. Just barely. Logan, she said lightly, there's no need to rely on computer tools to verify what we already know. But you can check it, Logan insisted. It's literally wrong as written. Jason shifted uncomfortably. He's right, he muttered under his breath. The room buzzed now, a soft murmur spreading like static. For the first time, Mrs. Whitmore wasn't in control. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm but cold. That will be all. Elijah, you may sit.
He didn't move. Ma'am, I wasn't trying to.
I said that will be all. The finality in her tone was sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. Elijah put the chalk down and turned toward his seat. His hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, from the anger of being dismissed even after proving himself. As he walked past her desk, she added quietly, next time, follow instructions. You're not here to rewrite the lesson. He stopped. For a moment he considered saying something, anything, but instead he swallowed the words like poison and sat back down. Logan's eyes followed him, guilt written across his face. He mouthed, "You were right," but Elijah didn't respond. The rest of the class moved on awkwardly. Mrs. Whitmore resumed her lecture, her voice steady, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened. But there was something different in the air now, something brittle. When the bell rang, students hurried out quickly, whispering as they went. No one dared look Elijah in the eye, no one except Logan. As Elijah gathered his things, Logan lingered. Hey, he said, hesitating. That was insane, what you did. You should have been teaching, not her. Elijah smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Doesn't matter, he said. She already decided I was wrong before I started. She was out of line, Logan said. She was careful, Elijah corrected. That's worse. Logan frowned. What do you mean? She didn't yell, didn't insult me, Elijah said quietly. She just made it sound like being smart was disobedient. That's how people like her win. Logan didn't know what to say. He'd never had to think about his teachers that way. Never had to see brilliance turned into defiance by the wrong tone, the wrong face. Mrs. Whitmore stayed at her desk pretending to shuffle papers. When the last student left, she finally looked up. Elijah, she said. He turned. You'll need to stay after school tomorrow, she said evenly. Detention. His eyebrows furrowed. For what? For disrupting the class and altering instructional material, she said smoothly. This isn't Eastwell. We have standards here. He stared at her. Speechless. She smiled faintly, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. You may go. Elijah left the room slowly, the hum of fluorescent lights fading behind him. Every step felt like walking deeper into a maze he hadn't agreed to enter. As soon as he disappeared down the hallway, Mrs. Whitmore turned to her computer, typing a brief report for the vice principal. Student exhibited defiant behavior during class instruction. Challenged authority. Requires corrective action. But she didn't notice the small red light blinking from across the room. Logan's phone, left recording from where he'd set it on his desk earlier. The video captured everything. Her tone, her words, her smirk. By evening, that footage would be quietly uploaded to a private group chat. And within 24 hours, it wouldn't be private anymore. Still, Elijah didn't know that yet. He walked home in silence, replaying the class over and over. The laughter, the smirks, the way even truth could be twisted when spoken by the wrong voice. When he got home, his mother, Denise, noticed his silence before he even said a word. "What happened?" she asked softly, putting down her mail. He hesitated. "Nothing. Just school." She studied him. The kind of nothing that leaves marks. He didn't answer. He went straight to his room, dropped his bag, and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his open notebook. The equations were still there. Neat, perfect, unchallenged. But now they felt meaningless. For the first time in years, he wondered if numbers could ever be pure in a world that wasn't. Back in her classroom, Mrs. Whitmore exhaled and erased the board, wiping away every trace of the problem that had undone her. Not the math itself, but the proof that her authority wasn't infallible. She didn't just erase chalk that afternoon. She erased evidence. And as the board turned blank, she whispered to herself, almost inaudibly, "Let's see how he handles consequences." Instead of acknowledging his brilliance, Mrs. Whitmore erased the board and wrote a detention slip. At 3:15 p.m. sharp the next day, Elijah sat alone in room 204, the classroom that had gone from a space of numbers and logic to a theater of humiliation. The desks had been rearranged, fewer now, pushed to the back. Mrs. Whitmore sat at her desk with her back to him, scribbling in her planner as if he didn't exist. The silence between them was thick and pointed. Elijah didn't look up. His pencil hovered over a blank worksheet she had left on his desk, labeled Behavior Reflection, Academic Integrity and Compliance. He had no intention of filling it out. He wasn't here because he cheated, spoke out of turn, or disrupted the class. He was here because he had solved the problem too well, so well in fact, that it embarrassed the person who assigned it. Mrs. Whitmore eventually stood, walked over, and placed a red folder on his desk. "You'll complete this packet before the hour ends. It covers academic discipline and protocol in rigorous environments." Elijah stared at the folder but didn't touch it. "I followed the math," he said calmly. "That's not what this is about," she replied. Her voice clipped. "This is about respect, following procedure, knowing your place in a structured environment." There it was. The unsaid said. Know your place. He met her eyes for the first time that day. "I wasn't disrespectful. You undermined my lesson," she said, the edge in her voice betraying the mask. In front of the entire class. "I corrected the problem," Elijah said. "That's what students are supposed to do when something doesn't make sense." Mrs. Whitmore's expression hardened. "You corrected what you thought was a problem. That's not the same thing." Elijah opened the red folder but didn't write. If Jason had done it, would he be in detention? Her lips pressed into a tight line. Jason didn't challenge the authority in the room.
"But I did. By being right."
"You're here because you refused to listen." "No," Elijah said, leaning forward slightly. "I'm here because I wasn't supposed to get it right." The room fell silent again. Only the hum of the overhead lights filling the tension. For the next 45 minutes, neither spoke. Elijah filled out none of the packet. Instead, he reviewed his own notes, redrawing the original problem and annotating every step he had taken. Not for her, for himself. At 4:00 p.m., the door opened. Vice Principal Granger stepped inside, his expression unreadable. A tall man in his late 40s. He was the kind who thought being neutral was the same as being fair. He looked from Elijah to Mrs. Whitmore and nodded once. "Elijah, your mother is here," he said. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flickered, the first real sign of discomfort. Denise Cross entered behind him, a blue USPS jacket slung over one arm, and a black spiral notebook in her hand. She didn't raise her voice, didn't even make eye contact with Mrs. Whitmore, as she walked straight to her son. "You okay?" she asked him quietly. Elijah nodded. "Yeah." She turned to the adults. "Let's talk." In the adjacent conference room, Denise sat across from Mrs. Whitmore and Granger. She didn't speak immediately. She placed the notebook on the table and opened it, page after page of neatly recorded dates, school forms, progress reports, emails. She began calmly. "My son transferred here because he was advanced. Eastwell didn't have anything more to challenge him." "You said Jefferson did." Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "That's correct." "So why is he in detention?" Granger interjected. There was a concern about classroom behavior. Ms. Whitmore felt Elijah's approach. "His approach?" Denise interrupted, raising her eyebrows. "You mean solving a problem that was wrong?" Mrs. Whitmore straightened. The problem was complex. He deviated from the assigned structure. And was he wrong? Denise pressed. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. He wasn't incorrect, but he bypassed instructions and altered. Denise snapped the notebook shut. He solved the damn problem. And your issue is that he solved it better than anyone expected him to. Granger shifted in his seat. Mrs. Cross, we don't see this as a racial issue. Denise leaned forward. You don't see it because you've never had to. But my son lives it. Her voice was low even, but every word hit with precision. You put a target on his back because he didn't flinch when someone tried to humiliate him. You don't want brilliant, you want obedient. Mrs. Whitmore's face reddened. I have taught this course for 22 years. And in those 22 years, Denise interrupted, how many black students have made it through without being called disruptive? The second they speak up, no one answered. Denise stood up. We're not asking for special treatment. We're demanding fair treatment. You won't silence my son because you're uncomfortable with how capable he is. Granger raised a hand, trying to de-escalate. Let's all agree to revisit this and ensure. No, Denise said sharply. There's no revisiting. He will not be serving detention again for using his brain. And if it happens again, I won't be calling the school board. I'll be calling the media. She turned to Mrs. Whitmore. Don't mistake my silence so far for ignorance. I see exactly what you're doing. And now, so will everyone else. Elijah watched his mother with quiet awe. He had never seen her like this. Composed, fierce, undeniable. Back in the hallway, as they walked toward the exit, Elijah finally spoke. Thanks for coming. Denise looked at him. Don't thank me. Just keep being exactly who you are. They want you to stop, because they know you won't. As they stepped outside, a car honked. It was Logan, parked in the pickup lane. He rolled down his window. Hey. Elijah stopped, surprised. I emailed the school board, Logan said, with the video. Elijah blinked. You what? Logan nodded. It's wrong what happened. I couldn't just let it go. Elijah looked at him, unsure whether to feel grateful or wary. Why'd you do it? Logan shrugged. Because I know what it feels like to be right and have people pretend you're not. It just doesn't happen to me as much. Denise narrowed her eyes. You got a copy of that video? Already uploaded it to Google Drive, Logan said. Sent it to a couple people too, just in case. Denise nodded slowly. Good. Keep it safe. As they walked home, Elijah felt something he hadn't in days. A flicker of hope. Not because things were fixed, but because someone else had seen it too. But just as that hope began to settle in, an email pinged on Elijah's phone. He opened it. His breath caught. Subject: Urgent. Review of academic conduct. From Vice Principal Granger. Body: Elijah. Your behavior has prompted further administrative review. You are to report to the guidance office first thing tomorrow morning. He read it again, then looked up at his mother. They're not done, he said. Denise's jaw clenched. Neither are we. Elijah's mother, a postal worker who never missed a shift, marched into school with a notebook of receipts. The next morning, Elijah sat outside the guidance office, his backpack slouched beside him, like a tired friend. The hallway was quiet, the kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful, only expectant. The cheap plastic chair creaked beneath him every time he shifted, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the dull gray floor tiles, mind racing through every possible outcome of what was about to happen. He'd barely slept. The email had hit harder than detention. This wasn't just a warning. It was escalation, and Jefferson High, for all its polished brochures and ivy-covered front gates, knew how to make things permanent, especially for students who didn't fit the culture. At exactly 7:58 a.m., the door opened. Ms. Vega, the front desk secretary, peeked out and gave him a tight smile. Elijah, you can come in now. He rose slowly, tightening the straps on his bag as if they could somehow hold back the weight of what was waiting on the other side of the door. Inside, the guidance office was bright, too bright. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled faintly of copy paper and lemon cleaner. Sterilely impersonal, at the long oak conference table sat Vice Principal Granger, arms folded, and Mrs. Whitmore, hands clasped neatly on the surface, wearing the same pastel blouse she wore the day before, as if nothing had changed. Elijah, Granger said, motioning to the seat across from them. Have a seat. He did. The chair was lower than theirs. Subtle but clear. Granger cleared his throat. This is not a disciplinary hearing, he began. but rather a conduct review. We want to ensure that there's clarity about expectations going forward. Elijah didn't speak. His mother's voice echoed in his head. Let them show you what they're trying to do. Don't help them build the trap. Mrs. Whitmore spoke next. Her tone was calm, practiced. Yesterday's events raised concerns about classroom dynamics. Elijah's approach, though technically correct, disrupted the instructional flow and undermined classroom norms. Classroom norms? Elijah said carefully. You mean challenging something that wasn't right? Whitmore smiled, as if amused by the question. I mean refusing to engage with structure. Education requires more than raw intelligence. It demands humility and collaboration. Granger nodded. We've reviewed the write-up and the incident summary. That word summary froze Elijah. Did you watch the video? Granger blinked. What video? Elijah's heart skipped. The one Logan recorded. Of the lesson. Of everything that happened. Mrs. Whitmore stiffened. Just slightly. Granger exchanged a glance with her. We weren't aware of any recording. Elijah leaned forward. Then how can you review what happened? Granger's voice lowered. We base our decisions on teacher reports, student conduct history, and overall behavioral patterns. I don't have a conduct history, Elijah replied. I've never even had detention before your teacher gave it to me for solving a math problem. Whitmore interjected smoothly. This isn't about punishment, Elijah. It's about perception. You're very bright. No one's denying that. But sometimes, when students like you, she caught herself but not fast enough. Elijah raised his eyebrows. Students like me? Granger cut in, his tone suddenly firm. No one is making this racial. That's when Elijah realized what this was really about. Not the problem. Not even the correction. It was about the room. How he'd made them all look when he stood up and didn't shrink. He exhaled, slow and controlled. So you're saying I'm being reviewed not for being wrong but for making her look wrong? Granger stiffened. That's an unfair characterization. Elijah didn't flinch. It's an accurate one. The vice principal leaned back in his chair. You're clearly very intelligent, Elijah. But there's something to be said for emotional intelligence. Sometimes the way we carry our intelligence, especially when we're young, can come off as arrogant, even hostile. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I've been doing this a long time, he added, and I can tell when a student is going to be a handful. It's rarely the loud ones. It's the quiet ones, the ones who walk in thinking they're already the smartest in the room. Elijah sat with that. He's too smart to be that quiet. The words weren't said, but they were implied in every sentence, every look. So you've made up your mind, Elijah said. You don't need evidence. You already decided what kind of student I am. Granger steepled his fingers. We're recommending a formal conduct note in your file. Nothing disciplinary, just something to flag for future reference. Elijah's stomach twisted. A conduct note wasn't suspension, but it followed you. It could be sent with transcripts. It could change how other teachers saw you before you even opened your mouth. On what basis? He asked, voice low. On behavioral concern, Granger replied. Repeated defiance in the classroom. But I was right, Elijah said. And Logan confirmed it. We don't adjudicate lessons by student vote. Mrs. Whitmore said smoothly. Authority must be maintained. And if that authority's wrong? He asked. Then it's corrected through the proper channels, she said. Not grandstanding in front of peers. He laughed bitterly. You mean I embarrassed you? She didn't respond. Granger picked up a form and began writing. Let's proceed with documenting the note. You'll be asked to sign it. It doesn't admit guilt, but it confirms you've been informed. Elijah stared at the paper being prepared to define him. A summary of events that ignored truth. A paragraph that could follow him for years. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. He was about to speak, to protest again, when there was a knock at the door. Everyone turned. Before Granger could respond, the door opened, and a voice rang out. I think you'll want to stop right there. In stepped Ms. Grace Hanley, the school's data science teacher, and the faculty advisor for Jefferson's coding club. She wasn't someone people usually noticed. She kept to herself, rarely intervened in campus politics. But this morning, her eyes were sharp, focused, and angry. She held up her tablet. I've seen the video. And if you put that mark on his record, I'll be the first one to go public with what actually happened in that classroom. Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened, then closed. Granger looked startled. Miss Hanley, I wasn't aware. No, you weren't, she snapped. Because you didn't ask. You didn't investigate. You relied on a report from one teacher with a long-standing pattern of disproportionately disciplining black students. Do you think no one's been watching? She stepped closer, placing the tablet on the table. The problem was miswritten. Elijah corrected it. She shut him down, then penalized him. And now you're trying to quietly bury it. Granger flushed. This is not a public matter. Hanley didn't blink. It is now. Elijah stared at her, stunned. He hadn't even known she knew his name. My mentor Logan, she added. He brought me the footage last night. He was scared. Scared you wouldn't believe him. Scared this school would do exactly what it's doing right now. Granger looked at the screen but didn't touch it. His face was a mask of conflict, fear, embarrassment, calculation. I suggest, Hanley said. Softer now. You take a moment before you finalize that paperwork. Mrs. Whitmore's hands were tight in her lap. This is an internal matter. You're overstepping.
No, Hanley replied coolly.
You did that when you erased his work off the board and tried to erase him from the classroom. Elijah exhaled, his first real breath of the morning. For the first time, he wasn't defending himself. Someone else had stepped into the line of fire. Granger sat back slowly. We'll postpone the conduct note pending further review. Hanley folded her arms. Good choice. Elijah stood, unsure what to say. Hanley turned to him. You don't owe them anything, she said. Walk tall. As he walked out of the office, his legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline, the hallway seemed to expand. Students were streaming to class, unaware that just minutes ago, something had cracked in Jefferson High's polished armor. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because later that afternoon, as Elijah returned to his locker, a folded note had been shoved into the vents. No name, just 5 words. Stop before it gets worse. Just as they were about to place a permanent mark on Elijah's record, a voice from the hallway interrupted the meeting. Logan Pierce had always known exactly who he was at Jefferson High. The golden boy. Varsity tennis captain of the mathletes. Straight A transcripts padded with AP credits and Model UN ribbons. Teachers smiled wider when he entered the room. Counselors gave him early access to scholarship programs. His parents had told him since middle school. You don't have to be the best, just better than the rest. And at Jefferson, being better had never been hard. Until Elijah crossed. Elijah hadn't come in loud. He hadn't challenged anyone directly. He just solved problems better, faster, cleaner, deeper. And he did it without asking for permission or praise. That, more than anything, had rattled Logan. At first he didn't know what to make of Elijah. The kid was quiet, intense. A transfer. And when Mrs. Whitmore picked him out on his first day and threw that absurd problem at him, Logan expected what most of the class did. A stumble. But instead Elijah exposed a flaw in the problem. In the process. In the performance they'd all bought into. And when Mrs. Whitmore responded with condescension and a detention slip, Logan felt something shift. He couldn't ignore it. That night, Logan rewatched the video he'd secretly recorded. Not out of malice but habit. He filmed everything. For review. For proof. For control. It was how he studied. But this video, this one was different. It caught everything. Elijah calmly correcting the flawed problem, Whitmore's refusal to acknowledge the mistake, and the exact moment her composure cracked when the class realized Elijah was right. The next morning, Logan hadn't planned to do anything. He told himself it wasn't his place. He wasn't the target. But then he saw the look on Elijah's face when he got that office summons. A mixture of dread and resignation that didn't belong to a kid who had done anything wrong. So Logan made a choice. He approached Ms. Hanley, the only faculty member he'd ever seen actually listen. He showed her the footage, his voice trembling slightly when he said, I think he's about to get railroaded. She didn't hesitate. Now, hours later, Logan stood in the hallway outside the vice principal's office, fidgeting with his phone, heart pounding in a way it never had before, a math competition or a final exam. He could hear muffled voices behind the closed door. Whitmore, Granger, and Elijah. He thought of walking away. Letting Miss Hanley handle it. Letting the system fail again, like it always had. But then he saw the janitor's closet. The one where he and his friends used to ditch study hall freshman year. He ducked inside, leaned against the wall, and pressed play. The video began to roll. He rewound it 3 times, just to be sure. Every line, every glance, every smirk. Then he hit share. He didn't send it to the whole school. Not yet. Just a few friends. The ones who actually paid attention. The ones who'd whisper it in the lunchroom. replay it in locker rooms, text it across grade levels, until even the teachers heard the echoes. When the door finally opened and Elijah stepped out, Logan was waiting. Elijah looked surprised, maybe even annoyed. "You waiting for the office?" Logan shook his head. "I was waiting for you." Elijah frowned. "Why?" Logan glanced down at his phone, then back up. "Because what happened in that room shouldn't be happening to anyone, and it definitely shouldn't be happening to you." Elijah's face was unreadable. "You don't have to get involved." "I already am," Logan said. "I showed the video to Ms. Hanley. She walked in and shut it all down." Elijah blinked. "You what?" "I couldn't just pretend it didn't happen," Logan said. "I mean, I've coasted in that class for years. She's been feeding us stuff we already knew, giving partial credit to kids who couldn't factor without a calculator. And then you show up and it's like she saw a threat." Elijah folded his arms, not ready to trust that this wasn't another setup. "You realize this could make things worse." "I know," Logan said, "but the truth's already out." He pulled out his phone and played the clip again. Elijah watched, stunned at first, then quietly furious, watching himself being dismissed, watching the lie being written in real time. When the video ended, Elijah looked up. "Why'd you record it in the first place?" Logan shrugged. "Habit. I like to study the way teachers solve problems. Helps me prep for nationals. But this time, I caught something I wasn't supposed to." Elijah sighed. "You realize they're gonna come after you now too, right?" "Let them," Logan said. "I'm white. They'll just give me detention and call my parents. They don't expect me to burn down the system, just benefit from it." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Elijah extended a hand. Not quite trust, but something close. Logan shook it. As they turned toward their next class, Logan hesitated. "You know, we could post it, publicly. Let the students decide what they believe." Elijah shook his head. "Not yet. Not until she does it again." "You think she will?" Elijah didn't smile. "She's not done with me. She just got started." They walked the rest of the hallway in silence, unaware that outside the school, two stories were already forming. The official one, where Elijah was under review, and the real one, already spreading like wildfire through student group chats, titled, "When Genius Gets Silenced, and Someone Hits Record." By the time lunch ended, dozens of students had seen it. By the time the last bell rang, it had reached a faculty group chat. But it was that night, long after the lights shut off at Jefferson High, that the real twist landed. Elijah received an anonymous DM from a classmate he barely knew. "You're not the first. Whitmore's done this before. We have proof. Want to see it?" He pulled out his phone and played the video he secretly recorded in class. The video had lived on Logan's phone for less than 24 hours before it became something else entirely. Proof. It started innocently enough. Logan had shared the clip with a few trusted classmates. No captions, no edits, just the raw truth. Elijah Cross calmly correcting a flawed equation, Mrs. Whitmore dismissing him, and a classroom full of tension as intellect was punished instead of praised. But something about the footage made it impossible to ignore. Maybe it was Elijah's poise, his careful tone, never disrespectful, never arrogant, just precise. Maybe it was the look on Mrs. Whitmore's face when he solved the problem. Or maybe it was the moment she handed him a detention slip, erasing the board as if she could also erase his genius. Whatever it was, the clip spread like wildfire. By 6:00 p.m. it had been reposted to 2 private student group chats. By 7:00 it had been screen recorded and posted to TikTok by a sophomore named Brianna, who captioned it, "Black student solves impossible problem. Teacher punishes him for being right. Jefferson High. Elijah Cross." Within hours, the views exploded. People didn't just watch the clip, they felt it. Comments poured in. "This is what systemic racism looks like in real time. That boy's face when she tells him he's wrong, even though he's right. Chills. They always act like we're angry when we're just correct. Protect Elijah, at all costs." By midnight, the video had 200. By 2 a.m., it hit Twitter. By sunrise, it was at 1.4 million views across platforms, with hundreds of thousands of shares, retweets, duets, and stitches. Local news stations began reaching out to Jefferson students for interviews. A popular black educator on YouTube reposted the video with the caption, "Young King. I see you. This happens every day. Now we have proof." Elijah was right trended by noon. Inside the Cross household, the notifications wouldn't stop. Elijah's phone buzzed so much overnight, He eventually turned it off and shoved it into a drawer. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't wanted a spotlight, just fairness. But fairness had turned into fame. Denise sat in the kitchen, flipping through her spiral notebook while her phone sat beside a coffee mug, lit up with texts from former coworkers, distant cousins, even a local civil rights attorney who offered representation for whatever might come next. "Elijah," she called softly. "You okay, baby?" He stood in the doorway, hoodie pulled tight around his face, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and confusion. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," she said, "but you didn't ask to be disrespected either." He slumped into a chair. "They're making me into a symbol. But I still have to walk into our classroom today. None of this changes that." Denise closed the notebook gently. "It might not change today, but it started something." He nodded, rubbing his eyes. "I just don't want them to twist it." "They already did," she said. "You just untwisted it in front of a million people." By the time they got to school, students were already watching the video on their phones. In the halls, some nodded at Elijah when he passed, silent acknowledgments. A few even whispered his name like he was part myth. But there were others too. Ones who narrowed their eyes, whispered with tighter mouths. Not everyone liked the mirror the video held up. Elijah kept his head down. At 10:42 a.m., just after the second bell rang, Mrs. Whitmore's classroom door opened. Not a knock. Not an announcement. Just the quiet click of the handle and the slow creak as a man stepped inside.
Superintendent Alan Rutherford, the most powerful education official in the district, walked into room 204 without a clipboard, without a smile, without a word.
The room fell dead silent. Mrs. Whitmore looked up, her marker frozen mid-sentence. "Mr. Rutherford," she said, her voice a shade higher than normal. "What brings you here?" He didn't answer. He scanned the room slowly, then spoke to the class. "Students," he said, "please gather your things. This room is temporarily closed for an administrative review." Nobody moved. He added, "Now." Chairs scraped, bags zipped. No one said a word. Elijah didn't make eye contact with anyone. He moved with the same precision he always used in math. No wasted motion. As the students filed out, Elijah saw Mrs. Whitmore's face turn pale. She tried to maintain her usual poise, but her jaw was tight, her hands trembling just slightly as she placed the marker back into its tray. Once the door closed, Superintendent Rutherford turned toward her. "I've reviewed the footage," he said. She didn't speak. "I've also reviewed your past 3 years of student evaluations, disciplinary reports and conduct referrals." Still, she said nothing. He stepped forward. "We'll be placing you on immediate administrative leave, pending a formal investigation." Her voice finally found its way out. "That video was taken without consent, yet it revealed conduct that violates district values and equity standards." He interrupted. "We do not build our classrooms on intimidation and gaslighting." She stiffened. "This is absurd." "One out-of-context clip. There are 7, he said coldly. She blinked. "What?" "Since this morning," he said, pulling out a folder from his bag. "We've received 7 separate student statements, with supporting video evidence. This wasn't an isolated moment, Mrs. Whitmore. This was a pattern." She opened her mouth, but there was nothing left to defend. Outside the door, students lingered. Whispers spread faster than fire. "Elijah's mom was right. She's done this before. People just never believed it. She tried to bury him. Now she's the one getting buried." Logan appeared beside Elijah, at the lockers, holding up his phone again. "She's trending," he said quietly, in the worst way. Elijah didn't even look. "What happens now?" Logan asked. Elijah shook his head. "That's not up to me." But he was wrong, because that evening, when Elijah got home, he found an email waiting in his inbox. It wasn't from the school. It was from a journalist, a national education correspondent, asking for an interview. And below that another message, this one from a youth math institute in Washington, D.C. Subject line, "You caught our attention." By the next morning, the district superintendent was sitting in Mrs. Whitmore's classroom, unannounced. When the video of Elijah went viral, the internet had already decided who the villain was. But inside the district offices of Jefferson County Schools, the story was far from settled. By Tuesday morning, Mrs. Elaine Whitmore had traded her calm classroom for the cold fluorescent lights of the administration conference room. Her once pristine confidence was cracked, though she hid it well. She wore a navy blazer, a string of pearls, and the same carefully composed expression she had worn while telling Elijah he was wrong. 3 district officials sat across from her. Superintendent Alan Rutherford, the head of HR, and a communications advisor who kept glancing nervously at her phone as new notifications rolled in. The superintendent began, his tone clipped. Mrs. Whitmore, the district is aware of the circulating footage. We've received over 400 emails, as well as a number of calls from local media outlets. We'd like to give you a chance to explain your perspective before we move forward. Mrs. Whitmore adjusted her glasses and clasped her hands neatly on the table. I appreciate the opportunity, but I want to make one thing clear. I've done nothing wrong. Rutherford raised an eyebrow. The video was edited, she said quickly. And even if it wasn't, it lacks context. What you saw was a snapshot of a lesson taken out of a long, challenging process of education. The communications advisor looked up. Can you elaborate on that? Whitmore leaned forward slightly, voice steady, almost rehearsed. My teaching philosophy is simple. I push my students to excellence. I don't lower my standards for anyone. It's what's made my classes successful for over 20 years. I've had students thank me for being strict because it prepared them for college. And Elijah Cross? Rutherford asked quietly. Her smile faltered only slightly. He's bright. Exceptionally so. But he's also, she paused, choosing her words carefully. Young. He hasn't learned yet that brilliance without humility can be destructive. My job is to refine that energy into discipline. Refine? The HR director repeated, skeptical.
Yes, Whitmore said, you can't teach excellence without pressure. Some students, especially the ones who've been told their whole lives that they're gifted, need to be challenged harder. It's not about punishment, it's about preparation. Rutherford's jaw tightened. He wasn't challenged, he was humiliated. Whitmore's smile stiffened again. That's a matter of perception. Students today are too sensitive to correction. They mistake accountability for oppression. The room went silent. Then, the communications advisor spoke cautiously. Mrs. Whitmore, there's a perception publicly and internally that this incident had racial undertones. Her eyes flashed. Just for a second. I won't tolerate that accusation. I have treated every student who's entered my classroom the same. The color of their skin has nothing to do with how I teach. Rutherford folded his hands. Then how do you explain the pattern? 8 other students of color have now come forward with similar experiences. Whitmore's tone cooled to ice. Patterns can be manufactured. Once the internet labels someone a villain, everyone wants to play victim. It's attention-seeking behavior, not true. The HR director sighed. You're aware this will likely go public, regardless of what we decide internally. I have nothing to hide, she said, chin lifted. I'm not apologizing for doing my job well. We don't apologize for high standards. That single sentence, would become the headline quote in every article that followed. By noon, the district released a brief statement to the press. Jefferson High School is reviewing allegations of misconduct involving a faculty member. We uphold the highest standards of academic excellence and equity. We caution against rushing to judgment based on incomplete information. The words academic excellence and equity didn't sit well together. Outside the school, reporters gathered, like vultures. News vans lined the curb. Parents whispered in parking lots. Students live-streamed from the bleachers. And somewhere between truth and perception, a storm brewed that neither side could contain. Elijah sat in his third period class, phone vibrating constantly in his pocket. He didn't look at it, but everyone else did. Every few minutes, someone would turn around and whisper, "That's him." He kept his eyes on his notebook, writing meaningless numbers to avoid meeting anyone's gaze. Logan sat beside him, scrolling through his phone. "She's talking to the press," he whispered. Elijah didn't look up. "I figured. She said she's being attacked for holding high standards. That she's the real victim." Elijah exhaled sharply, setting his pencil down. "She's trying to turn this into a narrative. The hard-working teacher bullied by the woke mob." Logan frowned. "Yeah, and people are eating it up. Half the comments are supporting her. They're calling you entitled for complaining." "Of course they are," Elijah said. "That's how it works. They always find a way to make us the aggressor." Across town, at the Jefferson County Board of Education, phones rang non-stop. National media had picked up the story, splitting it down ideological lines. One headline read, "Teacher canceled for demanding excellence. Is America too sensitive?" Another countered, "Black teen punished for genius. The quiet racism of the American classroom." But as the adults argued,
The students spoke louder. Brianna, the sophomore who'd first posted the clip, uploaded a follow-up video. In it, she looked straight into the camera. "They're calling this a misunderstanding," she said. "But if you've ever been the only black kid in an advanced class, you know exactly what this is. It's not about the math problem. It's about who's allowed to be brilliant." Her video hit 2 million views in a day. Underneath it, the comments flooded in. "I had a Mrs. Whitmore too. Different name. Same story." The moment he corrected her, she decided he was arrogant. Classic. This isn't an isolated event. This is culture. Elijah's name became a hashtag. Colleges started mentioning him in recruitment tweets. The local NAACP chapter released a statement calling for Mrs. Whitmore's removal. But still, the district stalled. Inside her home that evening, Whitmore sat at her dining table, surrounded by printed copies of emails from parents and colleagues. Some supportive, some vicious. Her husband, a retired engineer, placed a hand on her shoulder. "They're twisting it, Elaine. You're not a racist. You've dedicated your life to these kids." She nodded numbly. "I know, but perception is poison." Her husband hesitated. Maybe apologize, just to calm it down." She turned sharply. "For what? For expecting more?" He said nothing. Outside, the world was no longer hers to control. That night, a news anchor introduced the story on national television. A viral video from Jefferson High has reignited debate about bias in education. The teacher claims she's being punished for having high standards, while former students allege a pattern of racial discrimination. As the segment played, images of Elijah solving the problem filled the screen. His calm composure contrasted with her tight-lipped disapproval. In that moment, it was no longer about one classroom. It was about every classroom that had ever told a kid like Elijah that excellence had an attitude. At 11:37 p.m., as the story reached its peak, a tweet appeared. It came from a verified account, a name Jefferson hadn't seen in years. Camille Waters. Watching that video broke me. Mrs. Whitmore did this to me too. Senior year 2017. Same words. Same humiliation. I told the counselor. They said she didn't mean it like that. I still have the emails. The tweet exploded. Within minutes, hundreds of replies poured in, some remembering Camille, others adding their own stories. 10 minutes later, she posted again, "I'm tagging everyone else she's done this to. Tell your truth." And then came the list. 18 tagged names, each one a memory waiting to surface. But a former black student, now in college, posted her own story and tagged 18 others who had similar scars. The morning after Camille Waters' tweet, Jefferson High wasn't just in the news. It was the news. Her message cracked the dam, and by sunrise, the flood of testimonials had become impossible to ignore. Dozens of stories, each heartbreakingly similar, each unique in its pain, began to fill timelines and inboxes. They came from all corners of the country: college freshmen at Howard, juniors at UCLA, a recent graduate now working at a startup in Seattle, former students who had passed through room 204, bearing the same emotional bruises they had once thought were isolated, now realized they'd been part of something larger. A pattern, a system, a weapon disguised as structure. The stories were chilling in their consistency. A junior named Darian recounted the time Mrs. Whitmore lowered his quiz grade by 20 points because he showed too much work on a problem she said required brevity. Mia, now a sophomore at Temple University, posted screenshots of her final grade being bumped down a full letter after a single disagreement about logarithmic notation. Jordan shared an audio clip, quiet but unmistakable, where Whitmore's voice could be heard saying, "Some students need to be reminded that confidence is not the same as correctness." The student she'd said it to, a black girl who had just asked a clarifying question. The messages flooded Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, and even LinkedIn. The stories weren't loud. They were surgical. They didn't scream. They exposed. They were the kind of racism people like Mrs. Whitmore had always survived behind. Subtle enough to be deniable, cruel enough to leave scars. A Google Doc began circulating. Whitmore Watch, a record of rigged expectations. It listed names, incidents, years, links to emails, text messages, and even gradebook screenshots where black students had received lower marks for identical work submitted by their white peers. One entry simply read, "She erased my name from the board before I finished the equation. Said I was being dramatic. I was 12. The pressure that had once sat solely on Elijah's shoulders now spread out like fire across a dry forest. The spotlight that had threatened to burn him now illuminated the hidden structures around him. He watched it unfold in real time, sitting silently at the dining room table, his mother flipping through the notebook again, though now it sat beside a stack of legal documents mailed by civil rights organizations, offering pro bono support. Denise looked over at him. They're finally hearing what we've been whispering for years. Elijah nodded slowly. I didn't know it would turn into this. She reached across the table and gripped his hand.
That's how revolutions start.
One truth, loud enough to shake a lie that's been standing for decades. Logan called him later that day. You've seen the list, right? I've seen it, Elijah said. It's bad, man. Really bad. She's been doing this for over a decade. And no one said anything. Elijah murmured. They tried, Logan said, but the system never listened. Now it has no choice. As the stories accumulated, so did the pressure. Local news outlets pivoted from cautious language to aggressive headlines. Pattern of prejudice. Teacher accused of systemic targeting of black students. Justice or overreaction. A decade of allegations surface against Jefferson High educator. District scrambles as former students unite. Will accountability follow? The district, overwhelmed by the mounting evidence and public outcry, issued a second statement. The Jefferson County School Board will convene an emergency hearing to address allegations against faculty members. All affected students, past and present, are encouraged to submit testimony. We are committed to truth, transparency, and justice. And then, the emails went out. Elijah's came on a Wednesday evening. Its subject line stark and clinical. Notice of participant role. Emergency board hearing. The body of the message was brief. Too brief for the weight it carried. Dear Elijah Cross, you have been selected to present testimony at the upcoming Jefferson County School Board hearing. Your experience as documented in public reporting is considered central to the case. You will be the first to speak. He read it 3 times before saying anything. Denise sat across the room, scrolling through comments on her phone. When he finally looked up, she could tell something had shifted. They want me to speak, he said. Her posture stiffened. You don't have to say yes. I already did, he replied quietly. She rose, walked over, and placed her hands on his shoulders. Then say everything. Say what you've been carrying. Say what they never let us say in those rooms. He nodded, but fear simmered just beneath the calm. Not fear of speaking, but fear of what the truth might cost. He spent the next 2 days preparing, not writing a speech, just organizing thoughts, rereading the messages from former students, printing screenshots, highlighting contradictions in Mrs. Whitmore's public defense, listening to the audio Jordan had shared until he could recite every manipulative phrase from memory. On the morning of the hearing, he wore a simple button-down shirt and black slacks. No tie, no jacket, just the truth. Logan met him in the parking lot. You ready? Elijah took a deep breath. I don't think anyone's ever ready for this. But I'm done staying quiet. The school board auditorium was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters filled the aisles. Parents, teachers, and students crowded every seat. A row of district officials sat at a long table in front, each with a nameplate, a glass of water, and a silence heavy with expectation. Mrs. Whitmore sat to the side, behind her lawyer. Her face was unreadable, not regretful, not angry, just practice. When Elijah's name was called, he stood slowly. The room fell silent. He walked to the microphone with steady steps and stood there for a full 10 seconds before speaking, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he began. My name is Elijah Cross. I'm 16. I'm a student at Jefferson High, and for the past few weeks, I've learned more about power than I ever wanted to. He paused. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to be a hashtag. I didn't want to be the kid who went viral for being treated unfairly. I just wanted to learn. He scanned the faces in front of him. But what happened to me didn't start with one equation or one detention slip. It started with a system that decides who gets to be brilliant, who gets to be confident, who gets to be right. He opened a folder and held up a printout. This is the problem I was given. It was wrong. I solved it anyway. And when I did, I wasn't praised. I was punished. He pulled out a second page. This is a list of other students who went through the same thing. Different years, same tactics, same silence. He looked at the board directly. You're not just reviewing a teacher. You're reviewing a culture. One that masks bias as discipline. That teaches kids like me that being correct is an act of rebellion. The room was so quiet. The hum of the microphone echoed. I'm not here to destroy anyone's career. I'm here to stop the damage from continuing. He stepped back. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence was louder than anything else. As Elijah returned to his seat, the chair beside Mrs. Whitmore's lawyer slid back. A woman stood, not a student, not a journalist. It was her, Camille Waters. She walked slowly to the microphone, wearing a blazer and jeans, her college lanyard around her neck. She didn't wait for her name to be called. "I wasn't invited to speak," she said. "But I'm going to anyway." The school board called for an emergency hearing, and Elijah was invited to speak first. The boardroom held its breath. Camille's voice, steady, fierce, and unapologetically clear, reverberated off the hardwood walls, but Elijah's words still echoed louder in the hearts of those listening. There had been no theatrics in his testimony, no tears, no yelling, just precision, truth spoken with the same grace he used when solving a problem on the board. Nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. And now, he sat back in his seat, his palms lightly damp from the intensity, but his posture tall. For once his silence didn't mean invisibility. It meant he'd already said everything that needed saying. The chairwoman of the school board cleared her throat, but before she could call the next name on the list, Mrs. Whitmore's attorney leaned close and whispered in her ear. Whitmore, who hadn't reacted to any testimony so far, flinched, just slightly. Her fingers tightly folded in her lap began to twitch. Elijah noticed. So did Camille. The lawyer whispered something again, quieter this time. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flicked toward the far exit of the room. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She stood abruptly. Gasps rippled through the room. She didn't ask to be excused. She didn't make a statement. She simply turned and walked out, heels echoing against tile, silence following like a shadow. A board member started to rise. "Where is she?" Her lawyer calmly intercepted. "Mrs. Whitmore is feeling unwell and will not be continuing the hearing today." Unwell. It was the word of cowards, of escape. But the students in the room, current and former, knew better. She wasn't sick. She was exposed. Camille stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat beside Elijah, her presence grounding the moment in something more powerful than drama, collective memory. The chairwoman of the board composed herself, adjusted her papers, and addressed the crowd. "In light of Mrs. Whitmore's sudden departure, we will proceed with the scheduled testimonies. But I want to state clearly for the record, all statements submitted will still be reviewed, and disciplinary decisions will be made with or without her cooperation." But Elijah barely heard the rest. His mind was stuck on that moment, her eyes scanning the exit like a drowning woman, looking for shore. He had always imagined that justice came with noise, slamming gavels, shouts, courtroom declarations. But this justice was different. It came in the form of quiet facts that couldn't be denied, in the way truth shifted a room's gravity. When the hearing adjourned for lunch, Elijah stepped outside, into the cool air. The fall breeze cut across his face, crisp and clean, like a reset button. A small group of reporters hovered near the entrance, unsure whether to approach. He kept walking. Camille caught up beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "You okay?" He nodded. "I didn't think it would feel like that." "Like what?" "Like I wasn't alone anymore." She smiled softly. "That's what they count on. That we think we are." They walked in silence for a few minutes. Down the sidewalk that wrapped around the board office, students from the local community had gathered outside, holding signs. Some read, "Believe Black Students." Others had equations drawn next to slogans like "Truth, Tradition." Denise stood near the edge of the crowd, holding Elijah's old Eastwell sweatshirt like a flag. She locked eyes with her son and gave him a proud, tired nod. Elijah exhaled and looked at Camille. "What happens now?" Camille's expression darkened slightly. "That depends on whether the board cares about doing the right thing or just protecting their name." That afternoon, the hearing resumed. This time without Whitmore present. The testimonies flowed more freely. A Black father named Marcus took the podium to read from his daughter's journal, entries from 3 years ago that described how she'd cried after every AP Calc class, unsure if she was smart enough to breathe in that room. A former teacher admitted she'd once reported Whitmore for disciplinary inconsistencies, and was warned by the principal to not make waves. A white student from Whitmore's current class, nervous but shaking with guilt, admitted he had watched her call out students of color way more than others, but never said anything because it didn't affect my grade. The room was quiet after each person spoke, not because no one had anything to say, but because everyone was realizing how much they'd accepted as normal. In between testimonies, Elijah sat quietly, the weight of others' truths layering over his own. And then the board chairwoman announced a brief recess. Elijah stepped into the hallway and was met by Logan. "She left," Logan said, his voice tight. "She's not coming back." Elijah looked up.
You sure?
"She walked out the back entrance. I saw her get in a car, didn't even say a word to her lawyer." Elijah wasn't surprised, he was angry. "She gets to leave," he muttered. "She does damage for years, walks out the moment it catches up to her, and somehow still avoids accountability." Logan looked down. "She won't be back. And you're not done." "What do you mean?" Logan reached into his backpack and handed Elijah a USB drive. "I went through my old cloud storage," he said. "Found a folder from sophomore year, screenshots, notes, old graded homework. Remember how she always said there was no bias? Look at the comments. She praised my answer when I gave an approximation. She penalized you for not being precise enough on the same problem." Elijah took the drive, silent. "She didn't just hate being corrected," Logan added. "She hated being corrected by someone like you." And then for the first time in days, Elijah smiled. Not wide, not in triumph, but in understanding, the kind that comes when you finally see the full equation. He returned to the hearing room. The next person called to the podium was a counselor from the neighboring district, someone Elijah didn't recognize. She walked slowly to the mic, her hair in a tight bun, her hands shaking just slightly. "I'm here," she began, "because I used to be one of Elaine Whitmore's students, before she became a teacher." That sentence stopped the room cold. The counselor looked around. "She was a senior when I was a freshman. Back then she ran our peer tutoring club. Everyone respected her. Everyone trusted her. But even then she had a habit of picking certain students to help, and others to dismiss." A chill moved through the room. "She once told me," the counselor continued, voice breaking slightly, "some people don't need help. They need to realize they'll never be the top of the curve." Her hands gripped the edges of the podium. That moment stuck with me. Because I wasn't struggling. I had the highest test average that year. But I didn't look like the kind of student she was trained to uplift. The board sat stunned. "She wasn't just biased in her career," the counselor added. "She was conditioned by it. This didn't start in her classroom. It started in the culture that shaped her and rewarded her for keeping certain people in their place." And suddenly, the room wasn't just about Mrs. Whitmore anymore. It was about them all. Elijah felt the shift. The board members, the staff, the administrators, they all looked smaller now. Not because they were weak, but because the truth had finally cast a light on the shadows they'd grown too comfortable in. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Superintendent Rutherford stood. He looked tired, humbled. "Before we adjourn," he said, "we acknowledge that what began as an incident has revealed a structure, one that must be addressed publicly and systemically." But before he could finish, a voice interrupted from the rear of the room. "Excuse me," it called out. Everyone turned. A woman stepped forward, middle-aged, professional attire, holding a small black leather folder. "I'm from the Office of Civil Rights," she said calmly, "and we've opened a federal inquiry into the district's disciplinary and grading patterns over the past 10 years. Gasps. Silence. And then, just a single whisper near the front. "It's not just a school issue anymore." Mrs. Whitmore's lawyer whispered something to her, and suddenly, she stood and left the room. When the Office of Civil Rights official made her announcement, the entire room shifted. The air itself seemed to tense. The words "federal inquiry" cut through the district's polished veneer of control like a blade through silk. For the first time in Jefferson High's long, self-congratulatory history, it wasn't just a scandal, it was an indictment. Mrs. Whitmore's chair sat empty now, but her absence spoke louder than any defense she could have made. Her lawyer was gone too, leaving behind only a forgotten pen and a folder filled with carefully drafted excuses. The board members whispered amongst themselves in a flurry of bureaucratic panic, realizing that what had started as one student's complaint had spiraled into a public reckoning. Elijah sat silently near the back of the hearing room, his expression unreadable. Camille sat beside him, her fingers interlaced, her jaw tight. The counselor, who had once been one of Whitmore's early victims, wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blazer. Logan leaned against the wall near the exit, scrolling through his phone as notifications poured in. Every major outlet was covering the story now. Superintendent Rutherford stood stiffly at the front, trying to control the damage. "We appreciate your office's attention," he said carefully to the OCR representative. But I assure you, the district is fully capable of investigating and addressing internal. The woman interrupted, her tone even but firm. That's the problem, Mr. Rutherford. You've been capable for years. You just haven't been willing. He fell silent. The press conference that followed was brief, tense, and explosive. Cameras flashed like lightning as the superintendent stumbled through a prepared statement. Effective immediately, Mrs. Elaine Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending further review. The district is committed to fostering an inclusive environment, but the reporters weren't satisfied. Is it true she walked out of the hearing before the investigation concluded? Are you acknowledging racial bias in her teaching record? Will her resignation affect the pending federal case? Rutherford dodged each question like bullets. We cannot comment on personnel matters. By the end of the day, the district released one more statement. Short, sanitized, and deliberately vague. Mrs. Whitmore has chosen to resign for personal reasons. We thank her for her years of service to Jefferson High and wish her the best in her future endeavors. It was the kind of statement that turned accountability into an illusion. There was no apology, no admission, no closure, just escape. When Elijah read the statement on his phone that evening, his stomach twisted. The words personal reasons felt like an insult, as if her bias had been a bad habit instead of a weapon. Denise sat beside him on the couch, her reading glasses perched low as she scrolled through the same article. They're letting her walk out clean, she muttered. She doesn't have to face what she did, Elijah said quietly. She gets to just disappear. Denise looked at him. That's how power protects itself, baby. When the walls close in, it finds another door. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. So that's it? After everything? No, she said softly. That's not it. It's just her chapter that's closed. Not the story. Across town, in a modest suburban neighborhood, Elaine Whitmore sat alone in her living room. Blinds half drawn, her television muted as a news anchor, dissected her downfall. Her husband had left for his sister's house 2 days earlier, to give her space. She hadn't left the house since. On the table before her sat her resignation letter, 2 paragraphs, both hollow. To the Jefferson County School Board. After much reflection, I have decided to resign from my position, effective immediately. I have loved teaching and will cherish the memories made over 2 decades of education. I believe this decision is in the best interest of my family and the district. No mention of Elijah. No mention of accountability. Just the word cherish, scrawled across decades of harm. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You don't get to retire from consequences. She turned the phone off. Back at Jefferson, the faculty lounge had become a battlefield of whispers. Some teachers quietly celebrated her departure, the unspoken relief of watching a tyrant fall. Others defended her, claiming things were being exaggerated. She was tough on everyone, one teacher insisted. But she failed only certain kids, another countered. She held them to a higher standard. Someone muttered. Or a different one, came the reply. By the end of the week, the school had divided into camps, those who believed the truth, and those who clung to comfort. Elijah became the unintentional symbol of both. In class, students treated him differently now. Some avoided him, afraid of being caught on camera, or misquoted in a viral tweet. Others whispered words of encouragement that felt rehearsed. Hey man, you're brave for what you did. You really changed the school. Guess you showed her, huh? But Elijah didn't feel victorious. He felt exposed. He hadn't asked for this. The fame, the interviews, the expectations. He just wanted to learn in peace. That Friday, after the final bell, he stayed late in the math room, the one Miss Hanley had taken over since Whitmore's departure. She found him there, staring at a blank whiteboard. You know, you don't have to carry all this alone, she said gently. I'm not trying to, Elijah replied. It's just weird. Everyone keeps telling me how proud they are, but all I did was point out the truth. That's usually all it takes to start a revolution, she said with a faint smile. He shook his head. It doesn't feel like one. She's still got to leave on her terms. Miss Hanley walked to the board, picked up a marker, and wrote a simple equation. Justice nail closure. He looked up at her. She may never apologize, she said. People like her rarely do, but she can't rewrite the math of what she did. Not anymore. Every student she heard is finally speaking for themselves. You didn't just solve an equation, Elijah. You solved her pattern. Her words hung in the air. Later that night, Elijah walked home through the cool evening air. The town felt quieter now, less hostile, but still watching him. He passed the newsstand downtown, where the local paper's headline read, Jefferson educator resigns amid bias scandal. Investigation expands district-wide. He kept walking. When he got home, his mother was already at the kitchen table, sifting through a new pile of mail. She looked up as he entered, eyes weary but bright. Anything important? He asked. Mostly junk, she said, tossing aside envelopes. Then her fingers paused on one heavy paper, gold seal, his name embossed neatly in the center. She turned it over. This one's for you. Elijah frowned, taking the envelope. The return address read, The American Institute for Youth Mathematicians, Washington, D.C. He opened it carefully. Inside was a formal letter printed on thick stationery. Dear Mr. Cross, we were deeply moved by your recent demonstration of intellectual integrity, perseverance, and leadership. Your poise under pressure and commitment to truth represent the values we seek to cultivate in the next generation of thinkers. It is our pleasure to inform you that you have been awarded a full scholarship to attend our Summer Research Fellowship in Advanced Mathematics and Social Impact.
We look forward to welcoming you to the Institute this June.
Elijah read it twice before looking up, stunned. Mom. Denise's hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God. He handed her the letter. It's real. She read it silently, tears brimming in her eyes. It's real, baby. You did it. They see you. Elijah exhaled shakily. For the first time in weeks, something inside him uncoiled, a tension he didn't know he'd been holding since the day Mrs. Whitmore handed him that first problem. He looked down at the final line of the letter. Printed in elegant serif font, truth and precision are the twin pillars of progress. You embody both. As his mother hugged him tightly, he couldn't help but glance at the window, where his reflection stared back. The same quiet boy who once sat in the back of room 204, invisible to everyone but himself. Now the world was watching. But the real surprise came a week later, when Elijah received a letter from a prestigious institute. The letter from the American Institute for Youth Mathematicians felt heavy in his hands. The embossing of the seal, the confident prose, it all felt surreal. When Elijah read it again, closing his eyes and exhaling, he sensed a shift. For the first time in weeks, the world beyond Jefferson High held possibility, not just threat. Denise cried quietly into her apron. That evening, she'd stayed up late clearing space on the refrigerator. She taped the acceptance letter beside his earlier report cards, beside photos of his trophies, beside the math team banner. It was like building a shrine to his worth in a house that had always told him to be invisible. When the district's press release hit online, Jefferson student accepted into national fellowship, students and teachers alike buzzed through the halls. Some nodded at Elijah, with newfound respect. Others whispered in corners, but no one dared challenge him now. Logan texted him midday. That's about to be Dr. Cross in 10 years. Elijah smiled, partly because the joke was funny, partly because he didn't yet know if he'd ever accept that prediction. Ms. Hanley found him in the math classroom after school. She handed him an envelope. I got this from a colleague, she said softly. It came addressed to you. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded packet, legal letter size, with a header Cross and Associates, civil rights attorneys. His breath caught. He recognized that name from the emails Denise had forwarded. A firm that had volunteered to help guide his mother in case the district tried to retaliate. He looked up. What is this? Ms. Hanley's eyes were gentle, but firm. Open it. Whatever happens next, I want you to be as prepared as possible. He unfolded the pages. The first sheet was a letter formally offering pro bono representation to him and his family in any legal action related to the case. The second sheet listed several paths: a defamation claim, a request for injunctions, a possible lawsuit for damages, and civil rights complaint options. The third sheet was an authorization form, giving the firm power to collect and preserve evidence, request accounting records from the district, and more. He swallowed so hard it felt like choking. He hadn't imagined this yet. Here it was, waiting for him. Mom needs to see this, he said, voice low. He tucked it into his binder. They stayed late that night, sitting around the kitchen table with Denise's laptop open, reading through the firm's terms and comparing them to the stack of evidence they already had. The recorded video, Logan's drive, the student statements, Camille's tagged accounts. But even as excitement pulsed beneath their worry, Elijah felt a swirl of uncertainty. Accepting legal power meant legal fights. It meant headlines, investigators, legal proceedings. It meant being more than a student. It meant becoming a legal target. Over the next few days, the district announced that Mrs. Whitmore's resignation would be followed by a formal review of all disciplinary patterns at Jefferson High. The board promised equity measures, training for all faculty, and impartial oversight. Many dismissed those phrases as public relations gestures. But to Elijah they felt like cracks in a wall. His summer fellowship loomed ahead, 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., with some of the brightest young mathematicians in the nation. There they wouldn't just solve equations, they'd study models, algorithms, theoretical math at the intersection of public policy and justice. Elijah's mind danced at the thought, working on proofs, publishing research, being known not for conflict, but for creation. On the evening before his departure, he and his mother sat in the living room. His suitcase lay half-packed on the floor. Denise handed him the Cross & Associates packet. "You legally ready?" she asked. Her voice trembled just slightly. He nodded. "I think I want them to speak for us when I can't." She squeezed his hand. "You never had to bear all of it alone. You never will." He tucked the packet into his backpack, alongside his fellowship acceptance. Two powerful tools, opportunity and defense. Late that night as he lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling. It felt like the ceiling itself was too small now, too confining for what he'd become. A student, a plaintiff, a symbol. The next morning, before dawn, Denise brought him a steaming mug of cocoa. "You ready?" He nodded. The car ride to the airport was quiet, the hush of early morning beneath the hum of tires on pavement. At the terminal, his hands trembled slightly, as he hugged his mother tightly. "You belong," she whispered in his ear. "Don't you ever forget that." He boarded the flight and watched the ground fall away. In D.C., he arrived at the Institute's campus. Stately columns, pristine lawns, and lab rooms with whiteboards taller than he'd ever seen. It was unlike Jefferson in every way. No stale fluorescent lights, no hidden judgments. Here, brilliance was the baseline. On his first evening, they held an orientation dinner. He sat between bright faces, students from all over America, kids with pedigrees, scholarship winners, children of professors. They spoke excitedly about combinatorics and topology, but he felt their glances cautious, curious, respectful. He realized he was no longer entering a room where he had to prove himself. He was entering a room where he was assumed valid, until proven otherwise. The next morning, he joined a seminar on mathematics and social justice, led by Dr. Marissa Joe, whose research combined nonlinear systems and educational policy. The syllabus included projects on algorithmic fairness, predictive policing, and assessment bias. He felt for the first time that his injustice might fuel creation, not just complaint. In class, Dr. Zhao called on him. "Mr. Cross, I've read your story. I'd like your perspective on this assignment." His answer, tentative at first, was incisive. She nodded, impressed, then asked a follow-up question no one else had noticed. His peers looked at him differently after that. That night, the program founder introduced the fellows during a ceremony. Elijah's name was announced and applause rippled through the room. It wasn't fandom. It was recognition. But fame doesn't make darkness disappear. 3 days into the program, Denise called him late at night. "They've reached out," she said, voice tight. He sat up instantly. "Who?" "A news station in Jefferson County. They want an interview about your fellowship but also about the lawsuit. They've contacted your law firm's PR. They want your side." He paused. This was unexpected. He hadn't asked to be public again. He hadn't planned for cameras beyond campus. "You decide," Denise said. He exhaled. "I'll do it." And so he did. The interview aired locally that evening. He spoke carefully, firmly, recounting not just his pain, but the stories of the dozens who had spoken. The footage from the viral video played behind him, in the background. For a brief moment, he watched himself on screen, calm, composed, adamant. Later that night, exhausted, he returned to his dorm room. He opened a message from his law firm. "Please review and sign the memorandum of facts by 11:59 p.m. He accepted it. Then he checked his email. Among dozens of messages, "Congratulations. Congratulations." One subject line chilled him. "District response, confidential document enclosed." He clicked it. The attachment name was Whitmore Settlement Proposal. He stared, heart racing. But just days before he left, his mother found a letter in their mailbox, from a law firm. The settlement proposal sat in Elijah's inbox like a trapdoor. It was polite, carefully worded, offering a modest payout, non-disclosure clauses, and no admission of wrongdoing. The district wanted silence. They wanted closure that looked like compromise. But in reality, it was a lid to keep the story buried. His law firm, Cross & Associates, called an emergency meeting. In their modest office downtown, he and Denise sat across from 3 attorneys. The walls were lined with framed civil rights cases, photos of protests past, and quotes from freedom riders. For the first time, Elijah felt he wasn't alone in this fight. "The district wants you to take a deal," said Miss Patterson, lead counsel. Her tone was fierce but measured. "But this isn't just about you. It's about every student who's ever been silenced." "Elijah," Ms. Chan added, "you have standing, you have evidence, you have witnesses. We can file for injunctive relief now, to block them from suppressing records. We can seek class action status. This could become your case, but also their case, the people they've wronged before you." Denise nodded. "I want them held accountable, not just for my son, but for all of them." They drafted the complaint together, statements, video transcripts, mountain of evidence. They named defendants, Miss Whitmore Jefferson High, the Jefferson School District, and claimed violations of constitutional rights, racial discrimination, defamation, and failure to provide equal educational opportunity. They asked for damages, injunctive relief, and structural reform. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit was filed. Media watched. News outlets ran banners. Jefferson District sued for discrimination. Virus of prejudice goes to court. The district responded with a brief, denies all allegations, will defend vigorously. Now it was real. The courtroom became the new battlefield. On the first day of trial, Elijah walked into the courthouse hallway, suit pressed, tie straight, his heart thundering. Cameras flashed. Reporters surrounded him, some asking questions, others snapping images. He moved as if he were passing through a gauntlet, but he walked with purpose. Inside, the courtroom buzzed. Family members sat behind him, supported by friends, former students, civil rights leaders, and student groups. The judge, a stern woman in black robes, tapped her gavel, and the trial began. Opening statements were sharp. The district's lawyer painted Mrs. Whitmore as a dedicated teacher under attack by overzealous students and social media mobs. "This is not discrimination," he insisted. "It's misunderstanding." Then Miss Patterson rose for the plaintiffs. She recounted Elijah's story, the flawed problem, the detention, the viral video, the broken patterns revealed, the students who followed. She showed before and after grade records, the feedback comments from the teacher, student testimonies, even Camille's prior public story from college. She asked, how many more stories lie hidden because they lacked video proof? The case stretched on for days. Witness after witness, former students, digital media experts, education policy analysts, a specialist in implicit bias. Elijah watched it all, sitting quietly, absorbing every cross-examination, every tactic. When it was his turn to testify again, he felt the familiar weight of all those eyes. His voice was steady, but inside, doubt flickered. Could he hold it together? Could he speak the sum of injustice without fracturing? He stood, swore under oath, and looked across the courtroom. The district attorney sat poised, notes ready. Mrs. Whitmore, sitting behind them, watched with tight-lipped composure. The gallery pressed forward. Cameras rolled silently.
"Mr. Cross," the defense lawyer began, "you assert that you were discriminated against because of your race. How do you respond to those who say this is about discipline or classroom management, not race?"
His throat dry, Elijah took a breath. "Because every time I was corrected, my correction was turned into defiance. Every step I proved right, the room reset to make me wrong. That doesn't happen to everyone the same way. It's not about math. It's about who is allowed to be flawless." He recounted concrete moments. The detention slip, the erasure, the shifting from right to wrong, the public humiliation. He named students who spoke out. He called Ms. Hanley as a witness, who described her observations of Whitmore's pattern in other classes. He read aloud Camille's email from college. He showed Logan's folder of archived responses, letters Whitmore had made in grading that subtly penalized black students for lack of polish. The defense cross-examined him ferociously, trying to portray him as overreacting, as seeking validation, as opportunistic. But he met them, face calm, voice firm. He held the room in balance. Then came the unexpected twist. The door to the courtroom opened. A man stood in the doorway, his presence commanding attention. He wore a crisp suit, carried a file folder, and his name badge read Dr. Samuel Whitmore. He wasn't her husband, he was her twin brother. Gasps echoed as he strode to the stand. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I am Dr. Samuel Whitmore. I was unaware this litigation would be public so soon. But as the sibling of the defendant, I've reviewed her files, all of them, including her gradebooks, her evaluation history, and her personal files." He paused. Everyone leaned in. "In the process," he said, "I found not anomalies in Elijah's record, but patterns matching the claims brought here. And these patterns go far beyond his case." He placed the folder on the stand. The judge nodded. He continued, "I regret not speaking sooner, but as someone trusted within the family, I feared being dismissed as biased. But I can no longer remain silent." He opened the folder and laid out charts, papers, emails, teacher notes, internal memos where Whitmore had compared student performances by race, comments to colleagues, questioning whether ethnic minority students had attitude issues, notes about reassigning certain students to co-teachers for their benefit. The courtroom reeled. The defense lawyer's face drained color. Mrs. Whitmore's composure flickered, and she clutched the arms of her chair. Elijah's jaw went slack. Camille gasped. The judge's gavel rested poised between thunder and silence. Dr. Samuel Whitmore looked at his sister across the aisle. "I should have spoken long ago, but I stand here today to tell you. The harm is real. The case is beyond one student." Silence filled the room. The lines drawn in the trial suddenly blurred. And then the judge spoke. "All right. I want that folder scanned and entered into evidence. We will pause proceedings until late afternoon, so both parties may review this new material. Court is adjourned briefly." As the gavel fell, cameras flashed anew. Whispers swelled. Elijah remained immobile, absorbing the twist. He realized in that moment that this lawsuit was no longer just about him. It was unraveling a legacy. In court, as Elijah prepared to testify again, a surprise witness entered the room. The courtroom felt smaller, somehow, as the final ruling was read. The judge's voice trembled only slightly when she spoke the words that would change the trajectory of Elijah's life, and more quietly of Jefferson High itself. She declared the district and Mrs. Whitmore liable for violation of Elijah's rights, for racial discrimination, and for inflicting emotional harm. She ordered injunctive reform, changes to disciplinary policies, racial bias training for all faculty, independent oversight of grading practices, scholarships for marginalized students, and full expungement of Elijah's record. Relief washed over Elijah in waves. The weight he'd carried, of ignorance, of expectation, of being defined by others, began to lift. His chest felt hollow and full all at once. He had not only cleared his name, he had forced the system to change. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in quiet applause. Former students, families, reporters, and activists clustered around him. He hugged his mother, leaky-eyed, trembling. His legs shook. He wanted to laugh, cry, stand still and spin, all at once. When they stepped onto the steps, the press wrangled him in. Microphones thrust into his face. "How does it feel to win? What will you do now? What about Mrs. Whitmore? Will she repay what she took from you?" He responded simply, carefully, as he had done in the hearing. "I'm grateful to justice. I'm looking forward to what comes next, not just for me, but for every kid who's been taught silence instead of voice." Denise stood beside him, proud but wary. Every flash of a camera felt like a reminder. This fight had been fought in public, but the wounds had been private. She watched her son, small, strong, forever changed. In the weeks that followed, Jefferson High was forced to implement changes it had never considered. The school board passed new legislation. Elijah's clause, mandating random audits of grading by race, open disciplinary hearings for students, and an anonymous peer review system for complaints. The district began monthly racial bias training for all staff. Scholarships were created for underrepresented students in AP and honors classes. Whitmore's files were sealed, but her departure became part of public record. She could not erase her pattern any longer. Alumni and former students reached out to Elijah. Some sent letters of thanks. Others shared how their lives had been altered. Dropped GPAs, changed majors, doors closed after Whitmore's class. He read them silently, sometimes aloud in private, feeling their weight and their vindication. He still felt the scars. Every time he walked back into his old classroom, Every time someone mispronounced his name, every time a teacher hesitated before calling on him. But the ruling acted like a signal flare. The darkness in that system had been exposed. The foundations shaken. That fall, Elijah headed to his fellowship in D.C., but not as a runaway from prejudice. He went forward, carrying both the weight of his past and the clarity of his purpose. He arrived, suitcase in hand, tall and steady, ready to learn, ready to teach, ready to question. In his first workshop that semester, Dr. Joe invited him to co-lead a seminar on algorithmic equity in education. Students gathered, notebooks open, curious faces shining. Elijah stood before a room that expected brilliance, not apology. He drew the first symbol on the whiteboard, a simple equation representing fairness. Then he paused. He looked at the sea of fresh faces, the ones who hadn't seen his pain, didn't know his name before now, and he asked, "How do you prove fairness when systems are built on bias?" The question hung there, heavier than any verdict. Silence stretched. You could hear the hum of projectors, the click of pens, the hope in every pair of eyes. He waited, because this time, no one would force the answer. They would explore it together. As Elijah stood before his fellowship class that fall, marker in hand, he faced a room of new faces and asked the same question he was once forced to answer alone. No one should be judged before they're even heard. Malik deserved dignity, not suspicion. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unfairly accused, you know this pain runs deep. Type yes if you believe the truth should speak louder than prejudice. Subscribe if this broke your heart, and to never miss the stories that matter.